The quiet return. The rain in Greyhaven did not fall so much as it lingered. It clung to the air like a thought half-formed, drifting between the houses and settling into the narrow spaces between wooden fences, into the seams of doors, into the quiet corners where time seemed reluctant to move. By morning, everything held the dampness, the smell of salt and wet wood, the faint metallic tang of the ocean carried inland by a wind that never truly rested. Eleanor Whittaker had long ago stopped noticing when the rain began. She stood at the kitchen window, her hand resting lightly against the chipped porcelain of a teacup, the same one she had used for years, its thin crack running like a pale vein from rim to base. The tea had already cooled untouched. Outside, the narrow path leading to the shore blurred into gray, dissolving into fog. The house made its usual sounds around her. The low creak of settling wood. The distant, steady ticking of clocks she no longer wound but never removed. The soft whistle of wind pressing through the imperfect seal of the window frame. It was a house that remembered things, even when she did not. Eleanor lifted the cup slightly, turning it in her fingers. The crack caught the dim morning light, tracing something delicate and irreparable. She had meant to throw it away once, or twice, perhaps more. But it had remained as many things did, not out of necessity, but because it felt wrong to let it go. Still holding on, she murmured, though whether she spoke to the cup or herself she could not say. The kettle clicked softly behind her, long since finished. She did not move. The ocean could be heard faintly through the fog. A slow rhythmic breath. It was never silent, not truly. Even on the calmest days it carried a presence, as if reminding the town that something vast and patient lay just beyond sight. Eleanor turned from the window at last. Her slippers whispered against the wooden floorboards as she moved toward the small writing desk near the far wall. It was cluttered in a way that suggested not chaos but time. Stacked letters, some unopened, a fountain pen that no longer wrote smoothly, a small brass clock stopped at an uncertain hour. She sat, easing herself into the chair with a quiet sigh, and began the habitual sorting of papers. It was a ritual more than a task. She rarely expected to find anything new. That morning, however, something resisted her hand. At the back of the drawer, behind envelopes she had long ago decided not to revisit, her fingers brushed against a different texture. Thicker. Slightly rough. She paused. The rain tapped lightly against the window behind her, as though urging her forward. Eleanor drew the object out slowly. It was an envelope. Not new, certainly not, but not as worn as the others. The paper held its shape, its edges only faintly softened. Her name was written across the front in a hand she knew immediately, though she had not seen it in years. Her breath caught, not sharply, but with a quiet hesitation, as if the air itself had thickened. "Daniel," she said, the name almost soundless. Her husband's handwriting had always been careful, deliberate. Each letter placed with a patience she had once teased him about. He had said that words deserved to be treated properly, that rushing them made them forget themselves. She traced the ink with her fingertip. Cold. Of course it was cold. And yet, something about it felt recent. Impossible, she knew, but persistent all the same. Eleanor turned the envelope over. It had not been sealed. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She was certain she would have remembered this. A letter from Daniel, left unopened? That was not something she would have allowed. And yet, here it was, as though it had been waiting patiently for a moment she could not name. The clocks in the house ticked an uneven chorus. She opened the letter. The paper inside carried a faint scent, not strong enough to place, but familiar in the way certain memories are, hovering just beyond recognition. Ink perhaps, or something older, something tied to time itself. Her eyes moved slowly across the lines. There was no date, only a few sentences written in that same steady hand. If you find this, it means I never told you what I should have. There are things we leave unfinished not because we forget, but because we think there will be time. Go to the place by the cliff. You will understand what I could not say. Eleanor read it once. Then again. The words did not change. Outside, the rain softened, becoming something closer to mist. The light shifted slightly, though the sun remained hidden, diffused into a pale, indistinct glow. The place by the cliff, she repeated. There were many places by the cliff in Greyhaven. The coastline stretched unevenly, carved by years of wind and water. But there was one place, the one people meant when they said it that way. She had not been there in years, perhaps decades. Her hand trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the quiet weight of something returning, something that had been set aside so gently it had almost disappeared. Almost. The teacup sat beside her, forgotten. A small drop of water slipped from the window frame, falling onto the wooden sill with a soft, precise sound. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. For a long moment she did not move. Then slowly she stood. The house seemed to watch her. The clocks continued their patient ticking. And somewhere beyond the fog, the ocean waited. The man arrived on a morning when the fog had not yet decided whether to lift. Greyhaven did not often receive strangers, not in any lasting way. Visitors came and went with the seasons, drawn briefly by the quiet, the cliffs, the promise of something untouched. But this man did not move like a visitor. He walked as though he had been expected. Eleanor noticed him first from a distance. She had taken to walking more slowly these days, not out of necessity but habit, her steps measured against the rhythm of the sea. The path along the shore was damp beneath her shoes, the gravel softened by weeks of rain. The air carried the scent of salt and kelp, sharp and clean in a way that felt almost medicinal. The ocean stretched before her, muted under the low sky, its surface broken only by long, patient swells. And there he stood, not close to the water but not far from it either, positioned in that uncertain space where land seemed to hesitate before giving way entirely. His coat, dark, heavy, moved slightly with the wind, though he himself remained still, watching. It was not unusual for people to watch the sea. Greyhaven had always invited that kind of quiet contemplation. But there was something in the way he stood, something deliberate, almost familiar. Eleanor slowed. She told herself it was nothing. Just a man. Just another morning. Yet her gaze returned to him again and again, as though drawn by a thread she could not see. He did not turn. Not at first. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of distant gulls and the steady, underlying breath of the ocean. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter around herself, feeling the rough wool against her skin, the cold pressing through it regardless. When the man finally moved, it was not with urgency. He turned slowly, as though he had already known she was there. Their eyes met. For a moment brief but unmistakable, something passed between them. Recognition. Not clear, not defined, but present. Eleanor felt it like a flicker behind her ribs, a small, insistent disturbance. Have we met? The thought came unbidden. She did not speak it. Instead, she offered the smallest of nods, a gesture more instinct than intention. The man returned it. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable, but weighted. "Cold morning," he said at last. His voice was low, even. Not unfamiliar, though she could not have said why. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "They usually are." A faint smile touched his face, not quite reaching his eyes. "I imagine they don't change much here." "No," she said after a moment. "They don't." The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of the sea more strongly now. It filled the silence that followed, settling into the space where conversation might have continued. But neither of them seemed inclined to force it. "You're new," Eleanor said eventually. It was not a question. "Yes." He glanced back toward the water, his gaze lingering there as though it held something he had been trying to locate. "I used to be," he added after a pause. Eleanor frowned slightly. "Used to be." He did not look at her when he answered. "A long time ago." The words settled heavily, though they offered no clarity. She studied him more closely now. There was nothing particularly remarkable about his appearance. Age had marked him as it had marked her. Lines at the edges of his eyes, a certain stillness in his posture that came not from weakness, but from experience. And yet, there was something she could not quite reach. "I don't remember you," she said. It was not meant unkindly, simply a statement. "I wouldn't expect you to." That faint smile again. Not dismissive, not bitter, just certain. Eleanor felt a small, inexplicable irritation. Greyhaven isn't so large that people disappear entirely. "No," he agreed. "But they do change." She considered this. The ocean shifted behind him, a larger wave breaking with a low, distant crash. "People always say that," she said. "About change. And you don't believe it?" She hesitated. "I believe we notice it less than we think." He nodded as though this answer pleased him. "Yes," he said softly. "That's true." Another silence. This one longer. The man stepped slightly to the side, his shoes pressing into the damp earth, leaving a faint impression that filled slowly with water. "I've been meaning to come back," he said. "For some time." "Greyhaven doesn't usually call people back," Eleanor replied. "No," he said. "But sometimes people call themselves." She almost smiled at that. "Almost. Are you staying long?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet." His gaze drifted once more to the horizon. "There are things I need to finish." The word lingered. Finish. Eleanor thought, unexpectedly, of the letter folded in her coat pocket, of the words she had read that morning. Things we leave unfinished. She shifted slightly, feeling the paper against the fabric, as though it had weight beyond its size. "Well," she said, her voice softer now, "Greyhaven is as good a place as any for unfinished things." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to narrow. "Yes," he said. "I think it might be." A gull cried overhead, sharp and sudden, breaking the stillness. Eleanor stepped back. "I should be going." "Of course." She hesitated. "Eleanor Whitaker," she said. The introduction felt necessary, though she could not explain why. He nodded. "Thomas," he replied. "Thomas Reed." The name settled into her thoughts, turning slightly, as though searching for a place to belong. It did not find one. Not yet. "Well, Mr. Reed," she said. I suppose I'll see you around. I expect you will. She turned, beginning the slow walk back toward the town. The path felt different now, though she could not say how. Behind her, she knew without looking that he had returned his gaze to the sea. Watching. Waiting. The wind carried the faint, steady sound of the waves. And beneath it, almost lost in the distance, the quiet, persistent echo of something remembered. The bell above the door of the bakery did not ring so much as sigh, releasing a soft, worn sound that seemed to belong more to memory than to mechanism. As Eleanor Whittaker stepped inside and allowed the door to fall gently closed behind her, sealing out the damp persistence of Greyhaven's morning and replacing it with a warmth that felt almost deliberate in its kindness. The air within was thick with the scent of fresh bread, yeast and flour and something faintly sweet, perhaps cinnamon or honey, though it was never quite the same from one day to the next, and beneath it lingered the deeper smell of wood, aged and polished by years of hands and heat, a scent that settled into the lungs with quiet assurance. Margaret Hale stood behind the counter, her sleeves rolled just enough to suggest work without revealing strain. Her movements unhurried in the way of someone who understood that time, when treated gently, did not need to be chased. "You're late," Margaret said, though her tone carried no accusation, only the soft familiarity of repetition, as if the words had been spoken many times before and had long ago ceased to require precision. "I didn't realize I had a schedule," Eleanor replied, removing her gloves slowly, feeling the faint stiffness in her fingers as they adjusted to the warmth, the fabric brushing lightly against her skin. "You do," Margaret said, lifting a loaf from the counter and placing it carefully into a paper bag, the motion practiced and precise. "It simply changes when you're not paying attention." Eleanor allowed herself the smallest of smiles, though it did not fully settle. The bakery had always been like this, warm not only in temperature, but in presence, as though it existed slightly outside the rhythm of the town, resisting the quiet erosion that seemed to touch everything else. And yet, on this morning, something within it felt sharper, more aware, as though it too had noticed the subtle shift that Eleanor carried with her. She moved toward the window, where a small table waited, its surface worn smooth by years of use, and placed her hands against it briefly, feeling the faint grain beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in something solid. "There?" Margaret asked, already reaching for the kettle. "Yes," Eleanor said, after a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticed. Margaret poured the water with care, the thin stream catching the dim light that filtered through the fogged glass, and set the cup before her, its warmth immediate and reassuring, though Eleanor found herself watching it more than drinking, her gaze settling unconsciously on the faint line that ran along its surface. Crack. Not the same as the one at home, and yet similar enough to draw her attention, as though such imperfections carried a language of their own, one that repeated itself quietly across different objects, different places. Margaret followed her gaze. "That one's older than it looks," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth that bore the soft discoloration of long use. "It survived a fall once, though I can't quite remember when." Eleanor traced the edge of the cup lightly, feeling the subtle unevenness beneath her fingers. "It doesn't look broken," she said. "No," Margaret replied, her voice thoughtful, "but it remembers that it was." The words lingered between them, settling into the space like dust that had no intention of being disturbed. Eleanor lifted the cup at last, taking a slow sip, the heat spreading through her in a way that felt both comforting and insufficient, as though it could warm the surface without quite reaching whatever lay beneath. Outside, the fog pressed gently against the windows, diffusing the light into a pale, indistinct glow, while somewhere beyond it the ocean continued its steady, unseen motion, its sound faint but constant, like breath held just out of sight. "You saw him," Margaret said, not as a question, but as an observation that had been waiting. Eleanor lowered the cup slightly. "The man by the shore?" Margaret nodded, though she did not look up, her attention fixed instead on the careful arrangement of loaves along the counter, each placed with a precision that bordered on ritual. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice measured. "He introduced himself." "And?" Eleanor hesitated, feeling the memory of the encounter shift slightly, as though it had not yet settled into its final form. "He seemed," she began, then stopped, searching for a word that refused to arrive easily. "Familiar." Margaret's hands paused for just a moment before continuing. "Greyhaven does that," she said, though her tone suggested something more specific than the words themselves. "It's not the town," Eleanor replied, more quickly than she intended. "It's him." "And what about him?" Eleanor leaned back slightly, the chair beneath her giving a soft creak that echoed faintly against the wooden walls, as though the sound had nowhere else to go. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's as if I should remember him, but I don't, and that absence feels deliberate." Margaret turned then, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable in the soft light. "Not all memories leave cleanly," she said. "Some fade unevenly, like ink in the margins of a book, until what remains is only the sense that something used to be there." The phrase settled heavily. "In the margins," Eleanor repeated, almost to herself. Margaret inclined her head slightly, as though acknowledging a connection that had not yet been spoken aloud. "Yes." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around the cup. "There was a letter," she said, the words emerging slowly, as though they required careful handling. "From Daniel." Margaret did not react immediately, though something in her stillness suggested that she had been expecting this. "Recently?" she asked. "That's just it," Eleanor replied, her voice lowering. "It felt recent, but it couldn't be." She reached into her coat, the fabric brushing softly against her hand, and withdrew the folded paper, placing it gently on the table as though it might otherwise slip away. Margaret looked at it but did not touch it. "Some things arrive when they're ready," she said quietly. "That's not how time works," Eleanor replied, though without conviction. "No," Margaret agreed, "but it's often how memory does." The clocks in the bakery, fewer than in Eleanor's house but present nonetheless, ticked softly in uneven intervals, their quiet persistence filling the spaces between words. Eleanor unfolded the letter again, her eyes moving over the lines as though they might reveal something new if read enough times. "He told me to go to the place by the cliff," she said. Margaret's gaze shifted briefly toward the window, where the fog pressed closer now, as though listening. "And will you?" she asked. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she listened, to the faint scrape of a chair somewhere behind her, to the distant call of a gull filtered through glass, to the quiet, steady ticking that seemed to measure something more than time. "I don't know," she said at last. Margaret nodded, as though this uncertainty was itself an answer. "Well," she said, returning to her work, "Greyhaven has a way of making decisions for people who wait too long." Eleanor almost laughed, though the sound did not quite form. "Is that meant to be comforting?" "No," Margaret replied, her voice soft but certain. "Just accurate." The warmth of the bakery pressed gently around them, holding the moment in place, even as something within it shifted, subtle and persistent, like a memory beginning to return. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, there was a sense, quiet but unmistakable, that whatever had begun that morning was not finished yet. The house felt different that evening, though Eleanor could not have said precisely why. As she moved through its familiar rooms with a heightened awareness that turned each small sound into something deliberate, each shadow into something that lingered a fraction longer than it should have. The rain had returned, not in force, but in persistence, tapping lightly against the windows and slipping in thin lines down the glass, distorting the faint glow of the lamps outside into wavering shapes that seemed almost to shift when she was not looking directly at them. She lit the lamp in the sitting room, the soft amber light spreading outward and catching on the edges of objects that had long ago become part of the background of her life. The narrow bookshelf, the worn armchair, the small table where the cracked teacup now rested once more, its presence both ordinary and strangely insistent. Eleanor removed her coat slowly, hanging it by the door, the fabric releasing the faint scent of damp air into the room, mingling with the dry, slightly dusty smell of old wood and paper that never quite left the house. The clocks had begun their evening chorus. Some ran fast, others slow, their ticking overlapping in uneven patterns that created a quiet, restless rhythm, as though time itself had fractured into smaller, less reliable pieces. She moved toward the bookshelf almost without deciding to, her hand trailing lightly along its edge, feeling the slight roughness where the varnish had worn thin over the years, and paused before the row of books that had belonged to Daniel, their spines faded but intact, their arrangement unchanged since the day she had last touched them. "I should have gone through these," she murmured, though the thought carried no urgency, only a faint acknowledgement of something postponed too long. She selected one at random. The cover creaked softly as she opened it, releasing a faint, dry scent that spoke of time passed quietly, of pages turned long ago and then left undisturbed, and as she flipped through it absently, her fingers brushing against the paper with a light, almost hesitant touch, something caught her attention. Not a word, not a sentence, but a mark. Small. Deliberate. In the margin. Eleanor frowned slightly, bringing the book closer to the lamp, the light catching on the faint indentation of ink pressed into paper. Initials. Not hers. Not Daniel's. She stared at them, her mind moving slowly, as though reluctant to form a conclusion that had not yet fully taken shape. Dr. The letters were written carefully, though not in Daniel's hand, and not in any script she immediately recognized, and yet there was something about them, something in their placement, their quiet presence in the margin of a paragraph that otherwise held no particular significance, that felt intentional in a way she could not ignore. Eleanor turned the page. And then another. Again the same initials appeared, sometimes faint, sometimes more pronounced, always at the edge of the text, as though they existed just outside the main narrative, observing rather than participating. Her fingers grew still. A faint draft moved through the room, slipping beneath the door and brushing lightly against her ankles, cold enough to be noticed, though not strong enough to explain itself. "Who were you?" she asked, though the question remained unanswered. The rain continued its soft insistence against the windows, while somewhere beyond the house the ocean answered in its own steady voice, the sound low and continuous, as though it had been speaking long before she began to listen. Eleanor closed the book slowly, her thumb resting briefly on the edge of the page where the initials had appeared most clearly, as if trying to anchor the moment before it slipped away. "Tr," she repeated, the letters settling uneasily in her thoughts. "Thomas Reed." The name came without effort now. Too easily. She straightened slightly, feeling a quiet tension gather in her chest. Not sharp but persistent, like a thread being drawn slowly tighter. "It's just a coincidence," she said aloud, though the room did not seem to accept the explanation. The clocks ticked on, uneven, insistent. She placed the book on the table beside the teacup, the two objects aligning in a way that felt unintentional and yet somehow inevitable, as though they had been waiting to share the same space. The crack in the cup caught the light again, its thin line reflecting faintly, echoing the narrow strokes of the initials she had just seen, and for a moment the two seemed connected, not by reason but by something quieter, something that moved beneath the surface of things. Eleanor reached for the letter once more. The paper felt slightly warmer now, though she knew that could not be true. "Go to the place by the cliff." Her eyes lingered on the words. Outside, the wind shifted, pressing more firmly against the house, carrying with it the sharper scent of the sea, salt and distance and something else. Something older, something that seemed to belong not to the present, but to what had been left behind within it. Eleanor stood very still. The room held its breath. And though she did not yet understand what was unfolding, there was a growing sense, quiet but undeniable, that whatever she had once known, whatever she had allowed to fade into the indistinct edges of memory, was beginning, slowly and deliberately, to return. The memory did not return all at once, nor did it arrive with the clarity one might expect of something long buried and suddenly uncovered, but instead it drifted into Eleanor's mind in fragments, like pieces of paper carried on a slow tide, each one damp at the edges and difficult to hold, each one insisting upon its presence without offering explanation. It began, as many things in Greyhaven did, with rain. Not the soft, persistent rain that lingered in the air like a thought unwilling to resolve, but a heavier rain, one that struck the roof with a steadier rhythm, that gathered in narrow streams along the windows and fell from the eaves in uneven patterns, creating a sound that filled the house more completely, as though it had weight. Eleanor sat in her chair, the letter resting in her lap, the book still open beside her, and as she listened to the present rain echo faintly against the remembered one, she felt the boundaries between then and now begin to soften, not disappearing entirely, but shifting just enough to allow something through. There had been a night. She was certain of that much. A night when the wind had been stronger, when the cold had pressed more insistently against the walls, when the house had seemed less like a refuge and more like a place that needed defending, though from what she could not quite say. She had been younger, though not young, her movements quicker, her thoughts less inclined toward hesitation, and yet even then there had been a quietness about her, a tendency to observe before acting, to listen before deciding. And then, a sound, not loud, not urgent, but distinct enough to separate itself from the rain and the wind and the familiar language of the house. A knock. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the letter as the memory sharpened, though only just, as though it resisted being seen too clearly. She could recall the hesitation, the way she had remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, her attention fixed on the door, her mind moving through possibilities that did not quite form into conclusions, as though the act of naming them might make them more real than she was prepared to accept. Another knock, softer this time, or perhaps simply weaker. She had stood then, the floorboards beneath her feet giving a quiet, familiar creak, the air in the house cooler near the door, as though it had already begun to yield to whatever waited outside. The handle had felt cold, colder than it should have. And when she opened the door, the rain had moved inward, not forcefully, but with a quiet insistence, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and salt and something faintly metallic, something that lingered at the edges of recognition. The boy had been standing there, though even now, as the memory pressed closer, his face remained indistinct, as though time had smoothed its details into something softer, something less precise. She could recall the outline. Thin shoulders beneath a jacket too light for the weather. Hair darkened by rain, clinging unevenly to his forehead. Hands, yes, she remembered the hands, held close to his body, not in defiance, but in a kind of careful restraint, as though he understood instinctively that taking up too much space might result in being asked to leave. He had not spoken at first, and neither had she. The rain had filled the silence between them, each drop striking the ground with a small, consistent sound that seemed to measure something she could not yet name. "You shouldn't be out here," she had said eventually, though the words felt insufficient even as she spoke them. The boy had looked at her then, not directly, not in a way that demanded attention, but with a quiet steadiness that carried something deeper than simple need. "I won't stay long," he had said, his voice low, almost lost beneath the rain. Eleanor felt the echo of those words now, as though they had been waiting for her to hear them properly. "I just need," he had begun, and then stopped, the sentence trailing off not from uncertainty, but from a lack of something more essential, permission perhaps, or the belief that it might be granted. She could remember the moment of decision, though not the reasoning behind it, as though the act itself had occurred before thought had fully formed. She had stepped aside. "Come in," she had said. The memory faltered there, not disappearing but dimming, as though the light had shifted just enough to obscure what followed. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, pressing her fingers lightly against her temple, as though she might coax the rest into clarity, but it remained just beyond reach, present and absent at once. She could not remember what they had said after that, or if they had said anything at all. She could not remember how long he had stayed, or what he had needed, only that he had been there, that she had let him in, and that somehow it had mattered. The room around her returned slowly, the present reasserting itself with quiet persistence. The ticking of the clocks, the soft hum of the wind against the walls, the faint scent of old paper and wood settling once more into its familiar place. Eleanor opened her eyes. The letter remained in her lap. The book, open beside her, still bore the initials in its margins. "Tr," she whispered, though the sound carried no certainty. Outside, the rain had softened again, returning to its usual quiet presence, as though the past had withdrawn just enough to allow the present to breathe. But it had not gone. Not entirely. And Eleanor knew with a growing sense of inevitability that it would return again. The clocks in Greyhaven had always been more numerous than necessary, though few people could have said when that had begun or why, and over time they had come to resemble less a collection of instruments and more a quiet agreement among the town's inhabitants that time, left unattended, might behave unpredictably. It was Margaret who mentioned it first, though not directly, as she handed Eleanor a small paper bag one morning, the warmth of its contents seeping faintly through the thin layer of paper, carrying with it the comforting scent of bread that had only just left the oven. "He's taken an interest in the clocks," she said, as though commenting on the weather, her tone casual, though her eyes lingered just long enough to suggest intention. Eleanor accepted the bag, her fingers brushing briefly against Margaret's, the contact warm, grounding. "The man by the shore?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Margaret nodded, turning slightly to adjust something behind the counter, her movements precise in a way that suggested she preferred to let information settle rather than press it forward. "He says they're not broken," she added after a moment. Just unfinished. Eleanor frowned slightly, the word catching her attention in a way she could not quite explain. Clocks don't usually require finishing, she said, though without much conviction. No, Margaret replied. But perhaps time does. The conversation ended there, not because it had reached a conclusion, but because it had opened something that did not yet have a clear shape, and Eleanor found herself carrying the thought with her as she stepped back into the cool, salt-laden air, the wind catching briefly at her coat before settling again. She had not intended to seek him out, at least not consciously. And yet, as her steps carried her through the narrow streets of Greyhaven, past houses that leaned slightly with age and fences that bore the quiet marks of years of weather, she found herself drawn toward the small repair shop near the edge of town, a place that had stood empty for as long as she could remember, its windows clouded with dust and its door rarely, if ever, opened. Now, however, the door stood ajar. The bell above it gave a faint, uncertain sound as she pushed it open, the air inside cooler than the bakery but warmer than the street, carrying with it a layered scent of metal, oil, and old wood, all of it undercut by something sharper, something precise. Time, she thought, though she could not have said what that meant. The sound reached her first. Not a single ticking, but many. Each clock within the room marking its own rhythm, some steady, some uneven, their combined voices forming a quiet, complex pattern that filled the space without overwhelming it, as though each one had learned to exist alongside the others without demanding attention. Thomas Reed stood at a workbench near the far wall, his back partially turned, his hands moving with a careful deliberation that suggested both familiarity and respect, as though the object before him required not only skill but patience. He did not look up immediately. "I wondered when you would come," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, calm and unhurried. Eleanor paused just inside the doorway, her hand still resting lightly on the edge of the door, feeling the faint roughness of the wood beneath her fingers. "I didn't realize I was expected," she replied. He smiled slightly, though she could only see the edge of it as he continued his work. "Not expected," he said, "just likely." She stepped further inside, the floorboards beneath her feet responding with a soft, familiar creak that seemed to blend with the ticking around her, as though the house itself had begun to measure her presence. "You've been busy," she observed, her gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in the clocks, large and small, ornate and simple, each one open, exposed as though mid-conversation with the man who now tended them. "They needed attention," he said. "They've been like this for years." "Yes." Eleanor folded her hands lightly in front of her, feeling the coolness of the air settle against her skin. "And now they don't?" Thomas paused then, setting down a small tool with deliberate care before turning to face her fully, his expression thoughtful, though not guarded. "Some things wait," he said, "until someone is willing to see them properly." The words echoed faintly in her mind, connecting themselves to others she had heard recently, forming a pattern she had not yet deciphered. "And you are?" she asked. "Trying to be," he replied. There was no arrogance in the answer, only a quiet acknowledgement of effort. Eleanor moved closer, her attention drawn to the clock on the workbench, its inner mechanisms exposed, the delicate interplay of gears and springs revealed in a way that felt almost intimate. "Can they be fixed?" she asked. Thomas considered the question, his gaze shifting briefly to the clock before returning to her. "Most of them aren't broken," he said, echoing Margaret's words, though with a slight difference in tone. "They've simply stopped being understood." Eleanor let out a small breath, something between a sigh and a laugh. That sounds like something people say when they don't know how to repair something. Perhaps, he said, his voice softening slightly. Or perhaps it's something people say when they realize that repair isn't always about restoring what was, but about recognizing what remains. The ticking around them seemed to shift, though she knew it had not changed, only her awareness of it. "And what remains?" she asked. Thomas's gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary, not intrusive but steady, as though he were weighing something that had not yet been spoken. "Enough," he said finally. The answer did not satisfy her, but it did not feel incomplete. Eleanor glanced around the room once more, her eyes settling briefly on a smaller clock near the window, its hands frozen at a time she could not immediately place, its surface bearing a faint crack that caught the light in a way that felt strangely familiar. "Do you believe time can be repaired?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Thomas followed her gaze, his expression shifting slightly, though only just. "I think," he said slowly, "that time doesn't need repair." She waited. "It needs to be remembered properly." The words settled into the room, joining the quiet chorus of ticking, becoming part of its rhythm. Eleanor felt something within her shift, small but undeniable. Not understanding. Not yet. But movement. Outside, the wind rose briefly, pressing against the windows, carrying with it the distant, steady sound of the ocean, as though it too had something to say, something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to be heard. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, there was a growing sense, quiet but persistent, that whatever had begun in fragments was beginning, slowly and inevitably, to take shape. The path to the cliff had not changed in any way that could be easily named, and yet as Eleanor Whittaker walked it that afternoon, with the folded letter resting in the pocket of her coat like a quiet insistence she could neither ignore nor fully understand, it seemed to her that each step carried more weight than it once had, as though the ground itself remembered something she had long ago allowed herself to forget. The fog lay low over Greyhaven, not thick enough to obscure the way entirely, but dense enough to soften the edges of everything, the fences, the stones, the distant outline of the sea, until the world appeared less like a place of clear boundaries and more like something in the process of being recalled, uncertain and shifting. The air carried the familiar scent of salt and damp grass, sharpened slightly by the cold, while beneath it lingered the faint, metallic note that seemed to accompany the ocean on days when it felt closer than usual, as though its presence extended beyond sight and into the very texture of the air. Eleanor walked slowly, not out of hesitation, though there was some of that, but because the act itself required a kind of attention she had not expected, each movement drawing her further into a space that felt both known and unfamiliar, as though she were retracing a path she had once walked without realizing its significance. The sound of the sea grew louder as she approached, no longer a distant murmur but a steady, insistent rhythm, waves breaking against the rocks below with a force that could not be seen from the path but could be felt, reverberating faintly through the ground beneath her feet. She reached the edge at last. The cliff stretched before her, uneven and weathered, its surface marked by years of wind and rain, the grasses along its edge bending slightly in the persistent breeze, their movement soft but constant, like breath drawn and released without pause. Below, the ocean moved with quiet authority, its surface dark beneath the overcast sky, its waves rolling in long, measured intervals that suggested not urgency, but inevitability. Eleanor stood still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, the fabric of her coat shifting faintly with the wind, the cold pressing gently against her skin in a way that felt almost deliberate. "This is it," she said, though there was no one to hear her. The letter remained in her pocket. She did not take it out. Not yet. Instead, she allowed herself to look, not just at the sea, but at the place itself, at the subtle variations in the ground, the slight indentation where the grass gave way more easily, the way the rocks below seemed arranged not randomly, but with a kind of quiet order that suggested purpose. And then, a sensation. Not a memory, not fully, but something adjacent to it, something that hovered just at the edge of recognition, like a word she could almost recall but not quite speak. She stepped forward slightly, her shoes pressing into the damp earth, leaving shallow impressions that filled slowly with water, mirroring something she could not yet name. There had been a night. She knew that now. Not just the night of the boy at her door, but another night, or perhaps the same one extended beyond the walls of her house, when something had drawn her here to this exact place, though the details refused to settle into clarity. The wind shifted, stronger now, carrying with it a sharper gust of salt and cold, whipping lightly at her hair, brushing against her face with a touch that felt almost like a reminder. "Why here?" she asked, her voice carried away almost immediately, absorbed into the vastness before her. The ocean did not answer. Never did. And yet, as she stood there, listening to its steady motion, feeling the uneven ground beneath her feet, watching the way the fog moved in slow, deliberate currents along the water's surface, she began to understand. Not in words, not in a way that could be easily explained, but in a quieter, more instinctive sense, that this place held something unfinished. Not in the way of objects left undone or tasks abandoned, but in the way of moments interrupted, of choices made without full awareness of their consequence, of something that had begun here and had not yet found its end. Eleanor reached into her pocket at last, her fingers closing around the folded paper, feeling its familiar texture, the slight stiffness of its edges, the faint warmth it seemed to carry despite the cold. She unfolded it slowly, the motion careful, as though the act itself required respect. "Go to the place by the cliff." She read the words again, though they had not changed. "You always did choose your words carefully," she murmured, thinking of Daniel, of the way he had written, of the things he had said and the things he had not. Her gaze drifted outward once more, following the line of the horizon where sea and sky met in a blurred, indistinct boundary, neither fully separate nor entirely joined. And then, a thought, quiet, persistent. Not all things are meant to be remembered at once. She did not know where the thought came from. Perhaps from Margaret. Perhaps from Thomas. Or perhaps from somewhere within herself that had been waiting for the right moment to speak. Eleanor folded the letter again, her movements slower now, more deliberate, as though she understood at last that whatever this place held, it would not reveal itself through force or urgency, but through patience. The wind softened slightly. The waves continued their steady rhythm. And as she stood there, at the edge of something she could not yet fully see, she felt, not certainty, not clarity, but the unmistakable sense that she had returned not simply to a place, but to a moment that had never truly ended. The storm did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself with the dramatic certainty that stories often assign to such things, but instead gathered slowly over Greyhaven throughout the afternoon, the sky darkening in increments so subtle that no single moment could be identified as the beginning, and yet by evening it had become impossible to ignore, the air thick with anticipation, the wind carrying a sharper edge, the ocean's voice rising from a distant murmur to something deeper, more insistent. Eleanor had returned home before the worst of it, though the walk back from the cliff had felt longer than it should have, each step accompanied by a quiet awareness that something had shifted, not in the world itself perhaps, but in the way she occupied it, as though she had crossed an invisible boundary she could not retrace. The house greeted her with its familiar sounds, the low creak of wood, the uneven ticking of clocks, but even these seemed altered, their rhythms slightly more pronounced, as though they too responded to the gathering storm. She lit the lamps early. The soft amber light spread across the room, catching on the edges of objects and casting shadows that moved faintly with the subtle tremor of the wind pressing against the walls, the glass of the windows rattling just enough to be noticed, though not enough to cause alarm. The cracked teacup sat on the table, its thin line catching the light once more. A quiet, persistent presence that seemed to anchor the room in something both fragile and enduring. Eleanor poured herself tea, the steam rising in delicate spirals that dissipated quickly in the cooler air near the window, carrying with it the faint scent of leaves and warmth that felt insufficient against the growing force outside. By the time the first heavy rain struck, it did so with a certainty that transformed the storm from possibility into fact, each drop hitting the roof and windows with a sharper, more deliberate sound, the wind following close behind, pressing itself against the house with a strength that suggested intent. And then, a knock. Not imagined, not remembered, present. Eleanor froze, the cup halfway to her lips, the heat of it pressing lightly against her fingers, grounding her in the moment even as something within her shifted toward the door. The knock came again, louder this time, though still measured, as though the person outside understood the weight of asking to be let in. She set the cup down carefully, the porcelain making a soft, precise sound against the wood, and moved toward the door, her steps steady despite the quiet tension that had begun to gather in her chest. The handle felt cold, colder than it should have. She opened the door. The storm moved inward immediately, not in force but in presence, the wind slipping past her, carrying with it the sharp scent of salt and rain and something wilder, something less contained. Thomas stood there, his coat darkened by water, his hair damp, his expression calm despite the weather, as though the storm existed around him rather than upon him. "I thought you might need company," he said, his voice steady, though raised slightly to carry over the sound of the wind. Eleanor hesitated, the moment stretching just long enough to echo something she could not yet fully recall. "Yes," she said at last, stepping aside. "Come in." The words felt familiar. Too familiar. Thomas entered without haste, closing the door behind him with care, the sound of the latch settling into place a quiet counterpoint to the storm outside, which continued its steady assault against the house. "You chose a difficult evening to walk," Eleanor observed, watching as he removed his coat, the fabric heavy with water, the scent of rain and sea following him into the room. "I didn't choose the weather," he replied, a faint hint of something like amusement touching his voice. "Only the timing." Eleanor almost smiled, though the expression did not quite settle. She handed him a towel, the rough fabric brushing against his hands as he accepted it, drying his hair with slow, deliberate movements, as though in no particular hurry to complete the task. The clocks ticked around them, louder now, or perhaps only more noticeable against the backdrop of the storm. "You've been to the cliff," he said, not looking at her, his attention fixed instead on the small pool of water forming near the door. "Yes." A pause. "And?" Eleanor moved back toward the table, her hand resting briefly on the edge, feeling the smoothness of the wood beneath her fingers. I'm not sure what I was meant to understand, she said, her voice quieter now though steady. Only that something happened there. Thomas nodded slightly, as though this answer confirmed something he had already known. Understanding doesn't always come all at once, he said. No, Eleanor replied, her gaze shifting toward him sharper now. But you seem to know more than I do. The storm surged outside, a stronger gust of wind rattling the windows, the sound sharp enough to draw their attention briefly toward it before settling again into the background. Thomas remained still for a moment, the towel held loosely in his hands, his gaze lowered as though considering something that required care. There are things, he began slowly, that belong to more than one person. Eleanor's breath caught slightly, though she did not interrupt. And sometimes, he continued, one of them remembers before the other is ready. The words settled heavily, their meaning not fully clear, but undeniably present. Are you saying I'm not ready? She asked. I'm saying, he replied, lifting his gaze to meet hers at last, that remembering is not the same as knowing what to do with what you remember. The room seemed to hold the statement, the ticking of the clocks filling the silence that followed, each second marked with quiet insistence, as though time itself were listening. Eleanor stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing slightly, though not enough to feel comfortable. Then tell me, she said, her voice steady though softer now, what is it that I'm supposed to remember? Thomas opened his mouth slightly, as though the answer had already formed, as though it waited just behind his teeth, ready to be spoken. And then, he stopped. The moment stretched. The storm pressed harder against the house, the wind rising, the rain striking more forcefully against the windows, as though urging something forward. But Thomas only shook his head, almost imperceptibly. Not yet, he said. The words were quiet, but final. Eleanor felt something shift within her. Not anger, not quite, but a tightening. A sense of something withheld just beyond reach. You said you came here to finish something, she said, her voice carrying a sharper edge now. How can you finish it if you won't even begin? Thomas held her gaze, his expression steady, though there was something in it now, something deeper, something that had not been visible before. I have begun, he said. The answer did not satisfy her. But it did not feel untrue. The storm continued its steady, relentless rhythm outside, the house holding firm against it, the walls absorbing the force, the windows trembling but not breaking, as though accustomed to such moments. Eleanor turned slightly, her gaze falling once more on the cracked teacup, its thin line catching the shifting light, a small quiet fracture that had never quite been repaired. And as she stood there, listening to the storm, to the clocks, to the silence that lingered between herself and the man who seemed to carry more of her past than she did, she understood, though only faintly, that whatever truth waited to be revealed was not something that could be forced into the open. It would come, but only when it chose to. The storm did not fully subside until morning, though its violence diminished gradually, withdrawing in uneven breaths as the rain softened and the wind loosened its grip on the town, leaving behind a quiet that did not feel like peace so much as the aftermath of something that had unsettled more than the surface of things. Eleanor woke later than usual, though she could not say whether she had truly slept, as the night had passed in fragments, sounds of rain against the roof, the low murmur of Thomas's voice echoing in her thoughts, the persistent ticking of clocks marking time that seemed at once steady and uncertain. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and cooled tea, the lingering traces of the storm settling into its structure as though absorbed into memory. She moved slowly through the rooms, her fingers brushing absent-mindedly against surfaces she had known for years, feeling in each one a subtle shift, not in the object itself, but in her awareness of it, as though everything carried a second meaning she had only just begun to notice. Thomas had left before dawn. She knew this not because she had seen him go, but because the house held a different kind of silence now, one that suggested absence rather than rest, as though something that had briefly occupied its space had withdrawn, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its presence. On the table beside the cracked teacup lay the towel she had given him, folded with care, its edges aligned with a precision that felt deliberate, almost formal. Eleanor touched it lightly, the fabric still faintly cool, as though it had not yet fully returned to the warmth of the room. "He leaves things unfinished," she murmured, though she was not certain whether she spoke of him, of herself, or of something larger that encompassed them both. The clocks ticked on. Steady, uneven, persistent. She turned toward the bookshelf again, drawn not by intention, but by a quiet insistence that had begun to shape her movements in ways she did not entirely control, and reached once more for the book in which she had found the initials the night before. The cover opened with the same soft creak, the pages releasing their faint, dry scent, and as she turned them more carefully now, her attention no longer casual but focused, she began to notice things she had not seen before. Not just the initials, though they appeared again in the margins consistent and deliberate, but other marks as well, subtle and easily overlooked, small underlinings, faint notations, a pattern of attention that suggested someone had read these pages not once, but many times, each reading adding something new. Eleanor leaned closer, the light from the lamp falling more directly across the paper, illuminating a section she had passed over before, where the ink had pressed slightly deeper, leaving a mark that was not quite a word, but not entirely abstract. She turned the page. And then, the photograph slipped free. It fell not heavily, but with a soft, almost hesitant motion, landing against the table with a sound so slight it might have gone unnoticed, had her attention not been so completely drawn inward. Eleanor stared at it. For a moment she did not move. Then, slowly, she reached down and picked it up, her fingers careful, as though the object itself required a kind of respect she could not yet explain. The surface was smooth but worn at the edges, the image slightly faded, its colors muted by time, and yet clear enough to reveal what it held. Two figures, standing side by side. The first she recognized immediately. Daniel. Younger than she remembered him, though unmistakable, the same careful posture, the same quiet expression that suggested thought rather than speech, his gaze directed not at the camera, but slightly beyond it, as though he had been caught mid-consideration. The second, Eleanor's breath slowed. A boy. Thin. Slightly turned, as though unsure whether he should be fully present in the frame. His hair was darker, his face younger than any version of Thomas she had seen, and yet, there was no doubt, it was him. Thomas Reed, though not as he was now, as he had been. The realization did not arrive all at once, but unfolded slowly, each detail aligning with the next until the image could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. Daniel and Thomas, together, in a photograph she had never seen. Eleanor turned it over. There was writing on the back. Not Daniel's hand, not hers, the ink slightly uneven, as though written in haste or uncertainty. For what was given without asking. The words seemed to shift as she read them, not changing but deepening, as though their meaning extended beyond the surface into something she had not yet fully grasped. She felt the room tilt slightly, not physically but in perception, as though the alignment of things had shifted just enough to reveal a pattern she had not previously recognized. "How is this possible?" she whispered, though the question did not expect an answer. The clocks ticked on. The ocean breathed faintly in the distance. And somewhere within her, a memory stirred. Not new but not yet complete. Eleanor set the photograph carefully beside the letter, the two objects resting together on the table, their presence undeniable, their connection not yet fully understood, but impossible to ignore. And as she stood there, caught between what she remembered and what she was only just beginning to see, she understood, quietly but with growing certainty, that whatever had been hidden was no longer content to remain so. The day unfolded with a quiet heaviness that seemed to settle not only over Grey Haven but within Eleanor herself, as though the town and her thoughts had entered into some unspoken agreement to move more slowly, to allow each moment to linger just a little longer than necessary, as if in anticipation of something that had not yet been fully revealed. The fog had returned, though thinner now, lifting in gradual layers as the afternoon progressed, revealing the muted shapes of houses and distant shoreline with a clarity that felt provisional, as though it might withdraw again at any moment. Eleanor remained inside. The photograph lay before her on the table, its presence impossible to ignore, its quiet insistence drawing her gaze again and again, as though it contained something that required not only attention but acknowledgement. Daniel and the boy, Thomas, together. She traced the edge of the image lightly, her fingers moving along the worn border, feeling the slight roughness where time had softened its surface, as though the object itself had aged alongside the memory it carried. "You knew him," she said aloud, though the room did not respond. The question was not whether Daniel had known the boy. That was now undeniable. But how and why she had not. Or perhaps, why she had forgotten. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the wood creaking softly beneath her weight, the sound echoing faintly through the room, joining the steady ticking of the clocks that continued their quiet measurement of time, indifferent to the revelations unfolding within it. "What did we keep quiet?" she murmured, the words forming slowly, as though they required careful construction. The answer did not come in words. Instead, it came in fragments. Not sharp, not immediate, but gradual, like the slow clearing of fog from a landscape that had been obscured not entirely, but just enough to blur its details. She closed her eyes and allowed it. The rain again. Always the rain. But different now, not only outside but inside the memory, as though it had seeped into the very structure of it, softening edges, distorting shapes, making it more difficult to hold. The boy in the doorway. Yes, that much she remembered. But now, more. The warmth of the kitchen, the faint smell of tea and bread, the way the light had fallen unevenly across the table, casting shadows that shifted as the storm moved outside. The boy sitting, not speaking much. His hands still close to himself, though less tightly now, as though the act of being indoors had loosened something in him, though not entirely. "You can stay until the rain stops," she had said. The words returned with quiet clarity, their tone gentle, unremarkable, as though they had not carried any particular significance at the time. But they had. She could see it now, not in the words themselves, but in the way the boy had looked at her when she said them, the brief flicker of something that had passed across his face, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it, something more cautious, as though he had learned not to trust such offers too easily. You don't have to, he had begun. I know, she had replied before he could finish. The exchange had been simple, almost nothing, and yet it had remained. Eleanor's brow furrowed slightly as the memory pressed further, revealing not just the moment, but the silence that had followed, the quiet presence of two people occupying the same space without fully understanding what connected them. She remembered the sound of the clocks then too, though fewer, younger, their ticking steadier, less fractured than now, marking time without question. And she remembered a decision, not spoken, not even fully formed, the choice not to ask too many questions, not to inquire where he had come from, or why he had been out in the storm, or whether someone might be looking for him, not to call anyone, not to report. She had simply let him stay. The realization settled heavily, not as guilt, not as regret, but as something more complex, something that carried both weight and quiet understanding, as though she had done something she could not fully explain even now. Why didn't I tell anyone? She asked softly. The room offered no answer, but the memory did, not in words but in feeling, as it had seemed right. Because sometimes the absence of action is itself a choice. Because the boy had not asked for much, and she had not required an explanation. Eleanor opened her eyes slowly, the present returning in layers, the dim light of the room, the faint scent of wood and paper, the steady ticking of clocks that now seemed louder than before, as though they marked not only time, but the distance between what had been and what was only now being understood. She looked again at the photograph, at Daniel, at the boy. At some point, she said quietly, you met him. The statement felt certain now. Not a question, fact, but still incomplete. The ocean sounded faintly beyond the walls, its steady rhythm continuing, unchanged by the quiet revelations taking place within the house, as though it had always known, as though it had been waiting patiently for her to listen. Eleanor rose slowly, the chair giving its familiar creak, and moved toward the window, her hand resting lightly against the glass, feeling the faint coolness that remained even as the day began to soften. What did we decide not to say? She whispered. The fog shifted slightly, revealing a brief glimpse of the distant shore before closing again, as though offering and withdrawing in the same motion. And in that moment Eleanor understood, not fully, not yet, but enough, that silence, like memory, was not empty. It was filled with what had been left unsaid, and what had been left unsaid had not disappeared. It had simply waited. The memory did not return as a single clear image, nor did it arrive with the certainty that might have allowed Eleanor Whittaker to greet it without hesitation, but instead unfolded slowly, layer by delicate layer, as though time itself had been folded over it and was now, with careful reluctance, being drawn back to reveal what had always been there beneath. It was late afternoon, though the light within the room carried the indistinct quality of evening, filtered through clouds that had not yet decided whether to disperse or remain, casting everything in a muted, almost sepia tone that made the present feel less immediate, more like something already remembered. Eleanor sat at the table, the photograph and the letter before her, the cracked teacup resting slightly to the side, its familiar fracture catching the soft light in a way that seemed almost intentional, as though it marked not damage but endurance, and as she rested her hands lightly against the wood, feeling its smooth, worn surface beneath her fingertips, she allowed herself at last to follow the memory where it led. The boy had not left immediately. That was the first realization that came with clarity. He had remained longer than she had initially allowed herself to recall, Not simply until the rain lessened, but through the evening, through the slow dimming of the light, through the quiet transition from day into night that had settled over the house with a softness that now felt almost deceptive. She could see it more clearly now. The kitchen, warm despite the storm outside. The faint smell of bread still lingering from earlier that day, mingling with the sharper scent of damp clothing as the boy's jacket hung near the door, slowly releasing the rain it had absorbed. He had sat at the table, his posture careful, as though he were aware of the space he occupied and determined not to impose upon it more than necessary, his hands resting lightly in front of him, his gaze moving occasionally toward the window where the rain traced slow, uneven paths across the glass. "You can eat," she had said, placing a small plate before him, the gesture simple, unremarkable in itself, and yet now in recollection, carrying a weight that extended far beyond the act. He had hesitated, not out of refusal but from something deeper, a kind of uncertainty that suggested he was not accustomed to being offered such things without condition. "I'll pay you back," he had said, his voice quiet, almost lost beneath the steady rhythm of the rain. Eleanor remembered the way she had paused at that, not because the words surprised her, but because of the way they had been spoken, with a seriousness that felt out of place for someone so young, as though the idea of debt had already taken root in him in ways it should not have. "There's nothing to pay," she had replied, her tone gentle but firm, though she had not elaborated, sensing perhaps that explanation would only complicate something that did not require it. He had nodded, though not entirely convinced, and had begun to eat with a care that bordered on restraint, as though he were measuring each movement, ensuring that he did not take more than was offered, even when the offer itself had no clear boundary. The memory shifted, expanded. The sound of the clocks, fewer then but present, marking time with a steadiness that now felt almost foreign in its certainty. The light dimming further. The decision unspoken but undeniable, not to send him away when the rain slowed, not to insist that he continue on, wherever it was he had come from. "You can stay the night," she had said, the words emerging almost without thought, as though they had formed before she had fully considered them. The boy had looked up then, more directly than before, his expression changing in a way that had been subtle at the time, but now, in memory, unmistakable. "Are you sure?" he had asked. Eleanor had nodded. Yes. And that had been enough. No further explanation. No conditions. Just, yes. The memory pressed further still, revealing what had come after, what she had not allowed herself to remember until now. The boy asleep in the small chair near the window, his posture still slightly guarded even in rest, as though some part of him remained alert despite the quiet. The house settling around them, the storm easing into something softer, the rain no longer striking but lingering, its sound reduced to a gentle, persistent presence. And then, morning. He had been gone. Not abruptly, not in a way that suggested haste, but simply gone, as though he had understood instinctively that his presence was temporary, that the space he had been given was not one he could claim beyond its moment. On the table where he had sat there had been nothing. No note. No sign. Only the faint impression of his presence, already beginning to fade. Eleanor opened her eyes slowly, the present returning with a quiet insistence, the room around her unchanged and yet entirely different, as though it now contained not only what she could see, but what she had only just allowed herself to remember. "I didn't think it mattered," she said softly, her voice barely more than a breath. The words settled into the space between her and the objects before her, the letter, the photograph, the cup, each one now carrying a weight she had not previously understood. "I thought it was just a night." The clocks ticked on, steady, unforgiving, and yet not entirely indifferent, because now she could see it, not in full, not with complete clarity, but enough to understand that what she had considered small, almost insignificant, had not ended when the boy left her house. It had continued, somewhere, in ways she had never seen. And as the realization settled, quiet but undeniable, Eleanor felt something shift within her. Not regret, not sorrow, but a kind of awakening, as though a part of her life that had been written in invisible ink had suddenly begun to reveal itself. Thomas Reed did not come immediately after the memory returned to her, nor did he arrive at a moment that might have allowed Eleanor to greet him with the clarity she had hoped for, but instead appeared later that day, as the light had begun to soften into evening and the house had settled once more into its familiar quiet, as though he understood instinctively that what needed to be remembered could not be rushed by presence alone. She heard him before she saw him. Not a knock this time, but the faint sound of footsteps on the path outside, measured and unhurried, followed by the subtle shift of air near the door that suggested someone waiting rather than demanding entry. Eleanor stood from her chair, her movements slower now, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what she carried with her, the memory no longer distant, no longer fragmented, but present in a way that altered everything that followed. When she opened the door, the evening air moved inward, cool and tinged with salt, carrying with it the steady, distant sound of the ocean, which seemed louder now, or perhaps simply more noticeable, as though it had always been speaking and she had only just begun to listen. Thomas stood there as he had before, though something in his posture had changed, not outwardly, not in a way that could be easily named, but in the quiet awareness that passed between them before either spoke. "You remember," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor held his gaze, her expression steady, though not without softness. "Yes," she replied. The word felt heavier than its simplicity suggested. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as though something he had been holding had shifted, though not yet fully released. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside. "Yes." The repetition of the gesture, the same motion, the same words, did not escape her, though now it carried a different weight, a recognition that extended beyond the present moment into something that had begun decades earlier. Thomas entered quietly, closing the door behind him with the same care as before, the sound of the latch settling into place like the completion of something that had been left open too long. The room seemed smaller now, or perhaps more contained, as though the presence of what had been remembered had altered its proportions. Eleanor gestured toward the table. "I found this," she said, her voice steady, indicating the photograph. Thomas's gaze followed, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly as he took in the image, though there was no surprise in it, only a quiet acknowledgement of something long known. "You kept it," she added, though the statement carried uncertainty. "No," he said softly, stepping closer, his attention fixed on the photograph. "He did." Eleanor felt a slight tightening in her chest. "Daniel," she said. Thomas nodded. "Yes." The name lingered between them, not heavy but present, as though it too had a role in what was unfolding. "You knew each other," she said. It was not a question. Thomas's hand rested lightly on the back of the chair, his fingers tracing the wood with a slow, absent motion, as though grounding himself in something physical before continuing. "I found him," he said after a pause, his voice quiet but clear. "Years later." Eleanor listened, her attention fixed on him, the room around them receding slightly as the past began once more to unfold. I didn't know his name at first, he continued. Only that he lived here, that he might know you. The words settled carefully, each one placed with intention, as though he had considered them many times before speaking them aloud. You were gone when I came back, he added, his gaze lifting briefly to meet hers. Or perhaps I was too late. Eleanor frowned slightly, the timeline shifting in her mind, aligning itself with fragments she had not yet fully examined. You came back, she said, more to herself than to him. Yes. For what? Thomas hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of the answer. To understand, he said. The simplicity of the words did not diminish their significance. To understand what? Eleanor pressed, her voice softer now, though no less steady. Thomas looked at her then, truly looked, his expression carrying something that had not been visible before. Not guardedness, not hesitation, but a kind of quiet resolve that suggested the distance between what had been and what would now be spoken had begun, finally, to close. Why you helped me, he said. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. Eleanor felt them move through her, not as a shock, not as something unexpected, because in truth she had already begun to understand, but as a confirmation, a bringing into focus of something that had until now remained just beyond clarity. I didn't think it was important, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas's expression softened slightly, though his gaze remained steady. That's why it was, he replied. The clocks ticked around them. The ocean breathed in the distance. And in the quiet space between what had been remembered and what had yet to be fully spoken, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to mark the beginning of an ending that had taken decades to arrive. The evening settled around them with a softness that felt almost deliberate, as though Greyhaven itself had chosen to quiet its usual restlessness in order to make space for what was unfolding within Eleanor Whitaker's house, where the lamplight cast a warm, steady glow across the table and the objects upon it. The letter, the photograph, the cracked teacup, each of them now bound together by a meaning that had taken decades to emerge. Thomas Reed did not sit immediately, but remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the back of the chair, his posture composed yet carrying a subtle tension, as though he had arrived at a point he had imagined many times and now found the reality of it more complex than any memory could have prepared him for. Eleanor watched him quietly, her hands folded loosely before her, her gaze steady, though not without a trace of something softer, something that had begun as uncertainty and was now, slowly, giving way to recognition. You said you came back to understand, she said, her voice measured, each word placed carefully, as though she no longer wished to disturb the fragile clarity that had begun to form between them. But understanding does not usually take 40 years. Thomas let out a faint breath, something between a sigh and a quiet acknowledgement, before lowering himself into the chair opposite her, the wood giving a soft creak that echoed faintly in the room, blending with the steady ticking of the clocks. No, he said, his voice low but certain. It doesn't. The silence that followed was not empty, but full, carrying within it the weight of years that had passed separately and yet, in some quiet way, connected. I thought I would come back sooner, he continued after a moment, his gaze drifting briefly toward the photograph as though it anchored his thoughts. But life does not always move in the direction we expect, and sometimes the things we mean to return to become more distant not because we forget them, but because we do not yet know how to face them. Eleanor nodded slightly. the words resonating in a way that required no explanation. "And now?" she asked. Thomas's fingers moved lightly against the surface of the table, tracing a faint, absent pattern, as though following something only he could see. "Now I know," he said. "Know what?" He lifted his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time since he had arrived in Grey Haven, there was no hesitation in his expression, no sense of something held back or deferred, but instead a quiet, unwavering clarity that carried both certainty and something deeper, something that had been shaped by time rather than diminished by it. "That what you did," he said slowly, "was not small." Eleanor felt the words settle within her, not as a surprise, but as something that required reconsideration, as though a truth she had long dismissed was now asking to be seen differently. "It was only a night," she replied, though her voice carried less conviction than before, as though the phrase itself had begun to lose its meaning. Thomas shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "it was not." The clocks ticked on, marking the moment with quiet insistence. "I had nowhere to go," he continued, his voice steady though softer now, as though the act of speaking required a different kind of care. "And more than that, I had nowhere to belong, which is not the same thing, though it often feels like it is, and when you opened the door you did more than let me inside. You gave me a place where I was not being asked to prove anything, not being questioned, not being judged, and that—" He paused briefly, searching for the word that would hold the weight of what he meant. "That changes a person." Eleanor listened without interruption, her hands now resting more firmly against the table, as though grounding herself in something that felt at once familiar and entirely new. "I left in the morning," Thomas went on, "because I thought that was what I was supposed to do, because I believed that staying would mean taking more than I had been given, and I had already learned by then that taking too much from people comes with consequences, but what I didn't understand, what I couldn't understand then, was that what you gave me was not something that could be measured that way." He paused again, the silence stretching gently between them. "I carried that night with me," he said. "Though not always clearly, not always in a way that I could explain, but it was there. In the decisions I made, in the moments when I chose not to become something worse than I might have been, in the times when I allowed myself to trust that kindness could exist without condition." Eleanor felt a quiet shift within her, something loosening, something that had been held in place not by intention, but by habit. "I didn't expect anything in return," she said. "I know," Thomas replied, his voice softening further, "and that is why it stayed with me." The words settled into the room, joining the steady rhythm of the clocks, the faint, distant sound of the ocean, the quiet presence of objects that had witnessed more than they revealed. "I thought," he continued, "that I would come back and repay you somehow, that I would find a way to balance what had been given, but the longer I carried it, the more I understood that it doesn't work that way, that kindness is not a debt in the way we usually think of it, because it does not diminish when it is given, and it cannot be returned in the same form." Eleanor looked at him, her gaze steady, though now touched with something deeper, something that resembled understanding. "Then why come back at all?" she asked. Thomas considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "Because even if it cannot be repaid," he said, "it can be acknowledged." The answer did not resolve everything, but it did not need to. The room seemed to settle around them, the light softening further as evening deepened, the shadows lengthening in a way that felt less like darkness and more like rest. And in that quiet, Eleanor began to understand, not fully, not all at once, but enough, that what she had once dismissed as a small, passing act had not disappeared into the past, but had continued quietly and persistently, shaping a life she had never seen. The night that followed did not carry the heaviness of the storm that had come before, nor the restless uncertainty of the days that had led Eleanor to this moment, but instead unfolded with a quiet steadiness that felt almost unfamiliar, as though something within the fabric of her life had shifted in a way that allowed space where there had once been tension. Thomas had left not long after their conversation, though not with the same quiet withdrawal as before, but with a sense of completion that did not require announcement, as though the act of speaking what had remained unspoken for so long had altered not only what lay between them, but what lay within him as well. Eleanor remained at the table after he had gone, her hands resting lightly against the wood, the objects before her unchanged and yet transformed by what they now represented, the letter no longer a mystery to be solved, but a path that had led her, with careful precision, to something she had not known she needed to see. "You knew," she said softly, her gaze resting on Daniel's photograph, her voice carrying not accusation, but a quiet recognition, or at least you understood something I did not. The room did not answer, but it did not need to. Because now she could see it, the way Daniel had kept the photograph, the way he had written the letter not to explain, but to guide, as though he had trusted that the understanding would come not through words, but through the act of remembering itself. Eleanor reached for the teacup, her fingers tracing the familiar crack that had once seemed like a flaw, something fragile, something incomplete, and yet now felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. "You were never broken," she murmured, though whether she spoke to the cup, to herself, or to the past, she could not say. The clocks ticked on, though their rhythm seemed less insistent now, less fragmented, as though the act of understanding had brought them into a quiet alignment that did not require precision to feel whole. She rose slowly, moving through the house with a sense of lightness that was not physical, but internal, as though something she had carried without noticing had finally been set down. The windows reflected the dim glow of the lamps, the glass cool beneath her fingertips as she paused beside them, looking out toward the faint outline of the sea, now calmer, its surface barely visible through the thinning fog. 40 years, she said softly, the words carrying a quiet wonder rather than regret. 40 years in which a single night had continued to exist, not in her memory, but in someone else's life, shaping it in ways she had never seen, never imagined. The realization did not overwhelm her. Instead, it settled gently, like the tide returning to shore, steady and inevitable. "Perhaps nothing is ever as small as we think," she added, her voice almost lost in the quiet. The house seemed to agree, its familiar sounds no longer carrying the same weight, but instead forming a kind of quiet harmony that felt less like the passage of time and more like its presence. Eleanor returned to the table, gathering the letter and the photograph, not to put them away, but to hold them for a moment longer, as though acknowledging the journey they had taken to return to her. "Thank you," she said, though the words were not directed at any one person, but at something larger, something that had moved through her life without her fully understanding it until now. And in that moment she felt it clearly. The lifting of something she had not known she carried, the quiet release of a weight that had never been named. The change did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself in any way that might have allowed the people of Greyhaven to mark its beginning with certainty, but over the course of the following weeks, something within the town softened, as though the long-held tension between sea and sky, between fog and light, had loosened just enough to allow a different kind of season to emerge. The mornings grew warmer, though not in any dramatic sense, but in the subtle way that invited windows to remain open a little longer, that carried the scent of salt and sun warmed wood more gently through the air, that allowed the sound of the ocean to feel less like a distant presence and more like something that belonged. Eleanor Whitaker found herself walking more often, her steps less measured now, not because she had forgotten the past, but because she no longer felt the need to search for it in the same way, as though what had been hidden had finally found its place within her. The path to the cliff no longer carried the same weight, though it had not lost its significance, but instead felt integrated into something larger, a part of her life rather than a point of uncertainty within it. She visited it often, not to remember, but simply to be there. The ocean remained unchanged, its steady rhythm continuing as it always had, its waves rising and falling with the same quiet inevitability, and yet Eleanor heard it differently now, not as something separate from herself, but as something that moved alongside her thoughts, accompanying rather than echoing them. Thomas remained in Grey Haven, not as a visitor, not entirely as someone who had returned, but as something in between, as though he occupied a space that had always been waiting for him, even if neither he nor the town had fully recognized it before. The repair shop stayed open, its windows no longer clouded, its interior filled with the steady, patient work of hands that understood not only how to mend, but how to listen, and the clocks within it, though still imperfect, seemed less fractured, their rhythms no longer competing, but coexisting in a way that felt intentional. Eleanor visited occasionally, not often, and not with purpose. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. The silence between them no longer carried uncertainty, but a quiet ease, as though the need to explain had been replaced by something more complete. Margaret continued as she always had, her bakery warm, her presence steady, her words still carrying more meaning than they revealed at first glance, though now Eleanor found herself listening differently, hearing not only what was said, but what was allowed to remain unsaid. "You look lighter," Margaret remarked one morning, as she handed Eleanor a loaf wrapped in paper that still carried the warmth of the oven, the scent of it rising gently into the air. "Perhaps I am," Eleanor replied, her voice thoughtful, though touched with something that resembled quiet amusement. Margaret smiled, though she did not press further, as though she understood that some answers did not require elaboration. The cracked teacup remained. Eleanor did not replace it. She did not attempt to repair it. Instead, she used it as she always had, her fingers tracing its familiar line without hesitation, the crack no longer something to be overlooked or endured, but something to be acknowledged, a part of its history that did not diminish its purpose. One afternoon, as the light shifted toward something warmer, something closer to gold than gray, Eleanor sat by the window with the cup in her hands, the ocean visible in the distance, its surface reflecting the sky in a way that blurred the boundary between them. Thomas passed by on the path outside, his steps unhurried, his gaze briefly lifting to meet hers through the glass, and in that moment there was no question, no uncertainty, no need for recognition, only understanding. Eleanor raised the cup slightly, not as a gesture, but as a quiet acknowledgement. He nodded, and continued on. The clocks in the house ticked on, their rhythms steady, though no longer demanding attention, as though time itself had settled into a quieter form, one that did not insist on being measured so precisely. Eleanor leaned back slightly, the chair creaking softly beneath her, the sound familiar, comforting, part of a pattern that no longer felt fragmented. "What does home mean now?" she murmured, the question not pressing, not urgent, but simply present. She considered it, not in search of a definitive answer, but in the way one might consider the movement of the sea, observing, allowing, understanding without needing to conclude. Home, she realized, was not the house itself, though it held her memories, nor the town, though it had shaped her life, nor even the past, though it had returned to her in ways she could not have predicted. Home was what remained, what continued, what connected. The light lingered a little longer that evening, the sky holding its warmth as though reluctant to let it go. And as Eleanor sat there, the cup in her hands, the ocean before her, the quiet presence of a life that had revealed itself more fully than she had ever expected, she felt not closure but something gentler, a continuation. And in that continuation, there was no need to ask whether small acts of kindness mattered. Because now she knew. They did not disappear. They did not fade. They simply waited. And in time they returned,